In the heart of the desert, along the fertile ribbon of the Nile, a civilization rose that would shape the imagination of the world for thousands of years. Ancient Egypt was more than just a land of pyramids and mummies. It was a world of mighty pharaohs, ambitious queens, divine gods, and timeless monuments carved from stone and sand. Here, in this golden stretch of history, kings commanded armies across distant lands, priests unlocked the secrets of the stars, and architects raised structures that would defy time itself. From the first farmers who settled along the Nile's banks to the legendary Cleopatra, whose beauty and ambition intertwined with the fate of Rome, Egypt's story is one of power, belief, and survival. Through war and peace, glory and decline, this civilization reinvented itself across thousands of years, each era leaving its mark in temples, tombs, and texts. How did they achieve such greatness? How did a desert kingdom give birth to one of history's most enduring cultures? Tonight, we journey through the entire history of ancient Egypt, from the dawn of its first pharaohs to the fall of its last queen. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can join us on more journeys through history while you sleep, where the past comes alive and you wake up a little wiser every time. The story of ancient Egypt begins not with mighty pyramids or powerful pharaohs, but with a river that gave life to a desert and shaped one of the greatest civilizations in human history. Long before the first dynasties, before hieroglyphs were carved into temple walls, the Nile River was already carving its path through an unforgiving landscape. Around 10,000 BCE, the Sahara was not yet the vast desert we know today. It was greener, more fertile, dotted with grasslands and seasonal lakes. Here, in the Nile Valley, early groups of hunter-gatherers found a lifeline. They followed the migrations of animals, fished the river's waters, and gradually began to understand the seasonal rhythm of the floods. By 600 BCE, the world was changing. The Sahara dried, forcing people to settle closer to the Nile's banks. This was a turning point. The Nile, with its predictable inundation each year, became a natural calendar and a source of rich black silt that nourished the soil. Communities began to transition from a nomadic life to permanent farming villages. Wheat, barley, and flax became staples, while animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats were domesticated. The people learned to dig simple irrigation channels, turning floodwaters into a tool for prosperity. Small mud brick homes began to appear, and pottery became more refined, early signs of a society moving toward complexity. Trade and contact with neighboring regions played a crucial role in this transformation. From the south in Nubia came goods like gold and ivory. From the Levant to the northeast came tools, obsidian, and new ideas. These exchanges helped shape the culture and skills of the Nile settlers. As populations grew, so too did social structures. By 400 BCE, larger villages had emerged, often ruled by local chiefs who controlled land and resources. Cemeteries became more elaborate, indicating belief in an afterlife even at this early stage. It was also during this time that the seeds of Egyptian religion were planted. The people looked to the Nile as a divine force, a gift from the gods. Early deities reflected the natural world. Hapi, the god of the inundation; Horus, represented by the falcon, symbolizing the sky; and fertility goddesses tied to the rich soil and harvest. Spirituality was inseparable from daily survival. Technological and cultural advancements accelerated as the 4th millennium BCE unfolded. The Badarian and Naqada cultures, predecessors of the dynastic Egyptians, laid the foundation for many hallmarks of Egypt's later greatness. Pottery became more decorative, copper tools began to supplement stone, and artistic motifs, spirals, animals, and river scenes, hinted at a developing aesthetic identity. The Naqada II period, circa 3500 to 3200 BCE, saw the rise of fortified settlements and regional centers of power. Hierarchical societies began to take shape, with artisans, traders, farmers, and emerging elites. The Nile not only fed their crops but connected their communities. Boats carved from papyrus reeds glided along the waters, carrying goods and people between Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. This riverine highway laid the groundwork for the political unification that would soon follow. By the late 4th millennium BCE, competition between regional chiefs intensified. Warfare, alliances, and strategic marriages became common as leaders vied for control over fertile lands and key trade routes. In Upper Egypt, powerful centers such as Hierakonpolis and Abydos rose to prominence. They developed symbols of authority, including the white crown, which would later become part of the pharaonic regalia. Meanwhile, in Lower Egypt, in the Delta region, rival centers flourished with their own cultural traditions. Around 3100 BCE, this long period of regional competition culminated in the legendary unification of Egypt, traditionally credited to King Narmer, sometimes identified with Menes. He is depicted on the famous Narmer palette, wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing the merging of the two lands. This event marks the end of Egypt's prehistoric period and the dawn of the First Dynasty. Looking back, the birth of ancient Egypt was not a sudden event but a gradual evolution shaped by climate, geography, and human ingenuity. The Nile's floods turned barren land into fields of abundance. Its waters served as a corridor of exchange, its banks as the stage for early social and religious development. The people of this era laid the cornerstones for what would become one of history's most enduring civilizations, a land of monumental architecture, divine kings, and cultural achievements that would echo through the ages. This was the dawn of the Nile, the moment humanity took its first steps toward creating ancient Egypt, not with stone but with water, soil, and the will to survive. The story of ancient Egypt's transformation from scattered farming communities into a unified kingdom begins along the fertile banks of the Nile during the late pre-dynastic period, around 3200 to 3000 BCE. Before this monumental change, Egypt was divided into two distinct cultural and geographical regions. Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, where the Nile spreads into its wide delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea. Each region developed its own traditions, deities, and forms of governance. Upper Egypt, characterized by a narrower stretch of fertile land between cliffs and desert, had its own rulers, symbols, and crown, the white crown or hedget. Lower Egypt, with its marshlands and abundance of papyrus, was represented by the red crown or dishret. These two lands often engaged in trade but also in conflict, vying for control over resources, trade routes, and the life-giving Nile. It was in this dynamic and sometimes turbulent landscape that the figure of Narmer, often identified with Menes in ancient traditions, emerged as a powerful chieftain in Upper Egypt. Narmer is widely regarded as the first king to achieve the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, setting the foundation for the First Dynasty and what would become one of the most enduring civilizations in history. His reign marks the beginning of the early dynastic period, a time when the symbols, political structures, and religious traditions of pharaonic Egypt began to take their classic form. The process of unification was neither simple nor sudden. Archaeological evidence suggests that a series of gradual consolidations and alliances took place before a single ruler could claim dominion over both lands. Trade played a major role as goods like gold, copper, cedarwood, and luxury items passed along the Nile. Warfare also left its mark, with fortified towns and weapons showing that rival factions vied for supremacy. Narmer, a ruler from the city of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, seems to have built upon these earlier foundations, using both diplomacy and conquest to achieve his vision of a united Egypt. The most iconic artifact representing this unification is the Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone slab discovered at Hierakonpolis. On one side, Narmer is depicted wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, smiting a defeated enemy, symbolizing his victory over the north. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, parading with his standards and inspecting rows of decapitated foes. This dual imagery captures the essence of his accomplishment, bringing two lands under one rule. Above him, divine symbols such as the falcon god Horus suggest that the gods themselves sanctioned his conquest and kingship. Once the two lands were unified, Narmer established a new political center at Memphis, strategically located at the apex of the Nile Delta, where Upper and Lower Egypt converged. This location allowed control over both regions and became the administrative and cultural heart of early pharaonic Egypt. From Memphis, the early kings managed trade routes, agricultural production, and the collection of taxes in grain and goods, ensuring stability and prosperity in the newly formed kingdom. The unification also brought about the consolidation of religious practices and symbols that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia. The pharaoh was seen as the divine intermediary between the gods and the people, the living Horus on earth, tasked with maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and balance. Rituals, temples, and offerings became state-managed, and regional deities were integrated into a wider pantheon dominated by figures like Horus, Ra, and Ta. The double crown, or skent, symbolized the pharaoh's rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, merging the white and red crowns into a single headdress that became one of the most recognizable symbols of Egyptian kingship. The first dynasty, founded by Narmer or Menes, set the foundations for centralized authority and dynastic succession. His successors such as Horajah and Den continued to expand the power of the throne, establishing administrative divisions, tax systems, and networks of officials who would manage the vast resources of the Nile Valley. Early kings built elaborate tombs at Abydos and Saqqara, demonstrating both their divine status and their control over labor and materials. These burial complexes, while simpler than later pyramids, marked the beginning of Egypt's monumental architecture and its obsession with the afterlife. Life for ordinary Egyptians during this time began to take on the patterns that would remain stable for thousands of years. Farmers along the Nile cultivated wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables, using the predictable flood cycle to irrigate their fields. Craftsmen developed new skills in pottery, stone carving, and metallurgy. Trade routes extended beyond Egypt's borders to the Sinai Peninsula, Nubia, and the Levant, bringing in copper, turquoise, incense, and exotic woods. The centralized government facilitated this economic growth, with scribes recording taxes and goods using early hieroglyphic writing, which evolved during this period into a more formalized script. The unification also required managing diverse populations and regional traditions. The rulers of the first dynasty employed a combination of religious ideology, military presence, and administrative oversight to maintain order. Local leaders were often incorporated into the state hierarchy, and the redistribution of surplus grain helped prevent unrest. The concept of the pharaoh as a divine ruler ensured loyalty and reverence, reinforced by ceremonial processions, temple building, and the celebration of festivals like the Sed festival, which renewed the king's power. While Narmer is celebrated as the unifier, it is important to note that the process he initiated was maintained through constant vigilance. Rebellions in the delta, raids from neighboring lands, and internal disputes were challenges faced by the early pharaohs. Yet the system they built proved remarkably resilient, setting a precedent for centralized rule that lasted through multiple dynasties. Archaeological discoveries continue to shed light on this transformative era. The tombs at Abydos, with their grave goods and boat burials, suggest a belief in the afterlife and a connection to the gods that justified royal authority. Seals and inscriptions bearing the names of the first kings show the emergence of royal titulary, the set of names and titles used by pharaohs to express their divine mandate and earthly power. The combination of religious symbolism, military strength, and administrative control became the blueprint for Egyptian kingship. The foundation of Memphis also had a lasting cultural impact. Situated near the mouth of the Fayum and the apex of the delta, it served not only as a political capital but also as a religious center dedicated to Ptah, the god of craftsmen and creation. Over time, Memphis would grow into one of the largest and most influential cities in the ancient world, a hub of trade, culture, and innovation. By the end of the First Dynasty, Egypt had transformed from a patchwork of local chiefs and nomadic groups into a unified, stable kingdom under divine kingship. The traditions established by Narmer and his successors, the dual crown, the centralized bureaucracy, the integration of religion and governance, and the monumental tombs, laid the foundation for the Old Kingdom and the age of the pyramids that would follow. This was the moment when Egypt stepped onto the stage of history as a single, enduring civilization. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was not just a political event, it was the birth of a cultural identity that would last for over 3,000 years. It created the framework for a society that valued order, continuity, and the cyclical nature of life and death, all tied to the eternal flow of the Nile. Narmer's victory and the establishment of the First Dynasty marked the dawn of Pharaonic Egypt, a civilization that, from this point onward, would shape art, architecture, religion, and governance in ways that still fascinate the world today. The Old Kingdom marks one of the most iconic periods in the history of ancient Egypt, an age that would forever shape humanity's imagination of the land of the Nile. It was during this era that the Great Pyramids were conceived, designed, and constructed, rising like mountains of stone on the desert plateau. This period, often referred to as the Age of the Pyramids, began around 2686 BCE and lasted until about 2181 BCE. It witnessed the consolidation of royal power, the flourishing of art and architecture, the development of a centralized state, and the elevation of the pharaoh to the status of a living god. The Old Kingdom began with Egypt's Third Dynasty, following the unification achievements of earlier dynasties. One of the first great rulers of this period was King Djoser, whose name became immortal through the step pyramid at Saqqara, a structure unlike anything the world had seen before. Designed by his vizier and architect Imhotep, the Step Pyramid was not just a tomb but a revolutionary statement. A colossal stone monument reaching toward the heavens, reflecting the pharaoh's divine status and his desire to transcend mortality. The concept of using massive limestone blocks instead of mud brick transformed Egyptian architecture forever. The pharaoh during this time was more than just a king. He was believed to be a divine being, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and the son of Ra, the sun god. This belief elevated his authority to near-absolute levels. He was not only the political and military leader but also the chief religious figure, the intermediary between the gods and the people. His word was law, his projects were monumental, and his legacy was measured in stone. The fourth dynasty marked the golden zenith of pyramid building. Pharaoh Sneferu, the founding ruler of this dynasty, experimented with multiple pyramid designs. His architectural journey saw the construction of the bent pyramid and the red pyramid at Dashur. The bent pyramid, with its sudden change in angle, stands as a testament to early engineering challenges and the willingness to adapt. The red pyramid, on the other hand, became the first successful smooth-sided pyramid, a precursor to the grandeur that would follow. Then came the age of the great pyramid builders, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Khufu, also known as Cheops, commissioned the Great Pyramid of Giza, the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. Rising over 480 feet, built from an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, and aligned precisely with the cardinal points, the Great Pyramid was not only a tomb but also a cosmic symbol, a stairway to the heavens, and an eternal house for the king's Ka or life force. Its construction involved tens of thousands of workers, craftsmen, farmers during the inundation season, and a complex system of labor organization. Contrary to earlier myths, evidence suggests these workers were not slaves in chains but a labor force fed, housed, and respected for their service to the pharaoh. Khafre, Khufu's successor, continued the monumental legacy by constructing his own pyramid and the Great Sphinx, the enigmatic limestone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a pharaoh, likely his own. This symbol of strength, wisdom, and divine kingship still gazes across the Giza plateau, embodying the grandeur of the Old Kingdom. Menkaure, the next in line, built the third pyramid at Giza, smaller in size but notable for its intricate mortuary temples and finer craftsmanship. During this time, the central government reached a high degree of organization. The pharaoh relied on a hierarchy of officials, viziers, treasurers, overseers, and scribes, to manage the resources of the kingdom. The Nile's annual inundation provided fertile soil, and the agricultural surplus fueled the state's ability to fund massive building projects and sustain its population. Temples and estates dedicated to the gods and the royal mortuary cults were established, further entwining religion with governance. Religion in the Old Kingdom was a powerful force that permeated daily life. The concept of ma'at, order, balance, and justice, was central to the worldview. The pharaoh was seen as the maintainer of ma'at, ensuring harmony between the gods, the natural world, and society. Elaborate rituals, offerings, and festivals honored the pantheon of deities, with Ra, the sun god, gaining increasing prominence. The pyramid complexes were not just tombs. They were religious centers with causeways, mortuary temples, and valley temples where priests performed daily rituals to sustain the king's soul for eternity. Art and craftsmanship also flourished during this era. Sculptures of kings, nobles, and deities were characterized by idealized forms, symmetry, and a sense of eternal calm. Tomb walls were decorated with scenes of daily life, hunting, fishing, farming, and feasting, reflecting both the prosperity of the times and the belief in an afterlife that mirrored earthly existence. The hieroglyphic script became more refined, used not only for monumental inscriptions but also for administrative records and religious texts. Despite its grandeur, the Old Kingdom was not without challenges. The vast resources required for pyramid building placed strain on the economy. The growing power of the priesthood, particularly those associated with the sun god Ra at Heliopolis, began to rival that of the pharaoh. Provincial governors, or nomarchs, gradually accumulated wealth and autonomy, creating a tension between the central authority and regional power holders. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the system began to show signs of weakness. Repeated low Niles reduced agricultural output, leading to food shortages and social unrest. The lavish spending on royal tombs and mortuary cults, combined with corruption and administrative inefficiency, further destabilized the state. Pepi II, one of the last rulers of the Old Kingdom, had an exceptionally long reign, but by its end, the central authority had eroded significantly. This decline culminated in the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, famine, and conflict that followed the Old Kingdom. Yet, the legacy of the Age of Pyramids endured. The monuments at Giza and elsewhere remained as eternal symbols of human ambition, engineering brilliance, and the divine kingship that defined ancient Egypt's identity for millennia. The Old Kingdom was thus both a time of immense achievement and the seedbed of future challenges. It demonstrated the heights that centralized power, abundant resources, and religious zeal could achieve, but also the fragility of such a system when natural, economic, and political pressures converged. The vision of the pharaoh as a god-king surrounded by monumental stone mountains would echo throughout Egyptian history, even as the nation moved through cycles of unity and division. From the dawn of the Step Pyramid to the colossal Great Pyramid of Khufu, from the first attempts at smooth-sided tombs to the majestic alignment of sphinx and stars, this was the era when Egypt proclaimed its divine order to the world. The sands of Giza still whisper the story of that time, an age when men and gods seemed to walk closer together, and stone became the language of eternity. The Old Kingdom of Egypt had been a time of grandeur, marked by the construction of the pyramids, a centralized monarchy, and the powerful aura of the pharaoh as a living god. Yet, as the Old Kingdom drew to its close around 2181 BCE, the foundations of this once stable society began to crack. What followed was a period historians now call the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, famine, economic distress, and the emergence of competing local rulers. It was an era when the divine authority of the pharaoh faltered, and the unity of the Nile Valley dissolved into chaos. The collapse did not happen overnight. It was the result of mounting pressures that the Old Kingdom system could no longer withstand. Prolonged droughts and low Nile floods reduced the agricultural yields that Egypt so heavily relied upon. The lifeblood of the land, the Nile's predictable inundation, had failed to deliver sufficient water to sustain crops, leading to food shortages and eventually widespread famine. At the same time, the costs of massive pyramid projects had drained royal resources, and the central government found itself unable to effectively redistribute food or manage crises across its vast territory. As the Old Kingdom waned, the authority of the pharaoh weakened. The powerful nomarchs, regional governors who administered Egypt's provinces, known as nomes, began to act more independently. They controlled local resources, raised their own militias, and in some regions even claimed titles previously reserved for the royal court. Without the firm hand of a strong central government, the balance of power shifted from Memphis to the provinces, creating a patchwork of competing local rulers. This period, roughly spanning from 2181 to 2055 BCE, is divided by historians into two main phases: the early chaotic phase when central power almost entirely collapsed, and a later phase of consolidation under rival dynasties, particularly in Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt. Each sought to restore order and claim the title of pharaoh, but Egypt remained fractured for over a century. The social impact of this fragmentation was severe. Inscriptions and literary texts from this era, though often composed later during times of reunification, speak of widespread suffering, lawlessness, and despair. One famous text, known as the Admonitions of Epure, laments a world turned upside down, the poor becoming rich, the rich becoming poor, violence erupting in the streets, and hunger stalking the land. Whether this text reflects literal events or is a literary exaggeration, it paints a vivid picture of the anxiety and turmoil associated with this age. Famine was a recurring theme throughout this period. With the Nile's unpredictable floods, many communities faced starvation. Grain stores that were once managed and distributed by the central state became the property of local rulers, and competition for resources often turned violent. Tomb inscriptions from various nomes tell of local lords claiming to have saved their people from hunger by opening their granaries or distributing food, a sign both of their growing autonomy and the desperation of the times. As the Old Kingdom's massive pyramid-building projects ceased, the monumental architecture that had defined the previous centuries fell into disuse. Fewer large-scale tombs were constructed, and the craftsmanship of art and sculpture declined in many areas. Yet, ironically, this decentralization allowed local artistic traditions to flourish. In certain nomes, unique regional styles of tomb decoration and statuary developed, reflecting the rise of local identities in the absence of a unified cultural center. The early part of the First Intermediate Period saw a near-total collapse of the centralized monarchy. Memphis lost its grip on power, and various short-lived dynasties attempted to claim legitimacy, often without widespread recognition. Among these, the so-called 7th and 8th dynasties ruled briefly from Memphis but left little impact. Their reigns were marked by instability and frequent change of kings. Eventually, two main centers of power emerged. One in Heracleopolis near modern Beni Suef, in Lower Egypt, and another in Thebes, modern Luxor, in Upper Egypt. The Heracleopolitan rulers, forming the 9th and 10th dynasties, claimed control over the north and maintained a relatively stable administration, though their authority was often contested. In the south, Theban leaders of the 11th dynasty rose to prominence, initially as local governors but gradually asserting themselves as legitimate rulers. The rivalry between these two powers defined much of the later First Intermediate period. The Heracleopolitan kings relied on alliances with other northern nomes and tried to exert control over Middle Egypt. The Thebans, meanwhile, cultivated their own base of support, relying on the loyalty of Upper Egyptian nomarchs and a growing sense of regional identity. Military skirmishes between the two sides were frequent, as each sought to reunify the land under their banner. Amidst this political fragmentation, the religious landscape also evolved. The traditional role of the pharaoh as the divine intermediary between the gods and the people was weakened, and local temples gained influence. The cult of Osiris, god of the afterlife, grew more popular during this era, as common people began to embrace the idea that access to the afterlife was not solely the privilege of the king but something they too could aspire to through proper rituals and offerings. This shift in religious belief would have long-lasting implications for Egyptian culture. The daily lives of ordinary Egyptians during this time were marked by uncertainty. Farmers continued to tend the land along the Nile, but their livelihoods were threatened by poor harvests, high taxation by competing local rulers, and occasional raids or conflicts. Trade networks, once maintained by the central state, suffered disruptions and luxury goods became scarcer. However, there is also evidence of resilience. Local communities adapted to the new political realities, and in some areas prosperity even returned under strong local governance. As the First Intermediate period progressed, the balance of power began to tilt in favor of Thebes. Under leaders like Intef II and Intef III, the Theban dynasty expanded its influence northward, slowly encroaching on Heracleopolitan territory. These rulers styled themselves as kings and adopted royal titulary, signaling their ambition to reunify Egypt. Their successors, particularly Mentuhotep II, would eventually succeed in this goal, bringing the First Intermediate period to an end and ushering in the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep II, a Theban ruler, is often credited with the reunification of Egypt around 2055 BCE. His reign marked a turning point. By defeating the Heracleopolitan dynasty and consolidating control over both Upper and Lower Egypt, he restored a measure of stability and centralized authority. The reunification did not immediately erase the hardships of the previous century, but it set the stage for a cultural and political renaissance. The memory of the First Intermediate period lingered in the Egyptian consciousness for centuries. Later kings of the Middle and New Kingdoms portrayed it as a time of chaos and suffering that justified their own strong, centralized rule. For them, it was a cautionary tale of what happened when the divine order, Ma'at, was disrupted, and the land fell into Isfet, the chaos that the Egyptians so feared. Archaeologically, the First Intermediate period offers valuable insights into the adaptability of Egyptian society. Despite famine, warfare, and political collapse, the basic structures of Egyptian life endured. Local rulers left behind modest tombs and inscriptions, and common people continued to worship their gods, bury their dead, and tend their fields. This resilience laid the foundation for the remarkable revival that would follow. The First Intermediate period also marked a subtle but important transformation in the relationship between rulers and the ruled. The era demonstrated that the pharaoh was not invincible and that local leaders could, in times of crisis, step in to fill the void. This decentralization would influence later periods of Egyptian history, where power struggles between central and regional authorities would recur. By the time the Middle Kingdom emerged, Egypt had been profoundly changed by this century of turmoil. The lessons of the First Intermediate period, about the dangers of over-centralization, the importance of resource management, and the resilience of local communities, shaped the policies of the new rulers. They restored order not by attempting to recreate the grandeur of the Old Kingdom but by adopting a more pragmatic and balanced approach to governance. In sum, the First Intermediate period was a time of collapse and chaos, but also of survival and adaptation. It revealed the vulnerabilities of the Old Kingdom's system while highlighting the enduring strength of Egyptian culture. Though famine and political breakdown brought suffering to many, the spirit of Egypt endured, waiting for the moment when unity would be restored and the Nile Valley would once again flourish under a strong central rule. After a long period of political fragmentation, famine, and the loss of centralized control, Egypt began a journey of renewal. Around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep II of Thebes succeeded in reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt, marking the dawn of what historians call the Middle Kingdom. His victory brought an end to the first intermediate period and restored the idea of a single divine ruler who held the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic order that had been disrupted for decades. This reunification was not just political, it represented a psychological and cultural rebirth for a civilization that had once stood at the peak of grandeur and now sought to reclaim its identity. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom understood the mistakes of the past. They strengthened provincial administration, reducing the unchecked power of local governors that had once divided the land. The capital was established at Ich-Toi, near modern-day Fayum, a central location that allowed better oversight of the two lands. These rulers also placed a new emphasis on infrastructure and internal development, expanding irrigation systems, reclaiming farmland, and improving food security to prevent the return of devastating famines. Trade flourished as Egypt reconnected with distant lands. Expeditions were sent to Nubia for gold and ivory, to the Levant for timber and copper, and across the eastern desert to the Red Sea for exotic goods. The Middle Kingdom became a hub of commerce, its caravans and ships carrying treasures that enriched the royal coffers and supported an ambitious building program. Fortresses were built along the Nile to secure borders and protect vital trade routes, while new mining expeditions penetrated the Sinai Peninsula. Culturally, this era marked a renaissance. Literature, art, and religious thought reached new heights of sophistication. The pharaoh was no longer seen solely as an untouchable god but as a shepherd of his people, a ruler who bore responsibility for their welfare. Texts like the Tale of Sinuhe and the Instructions of Amenemhat reflected a more personal and introspective vision of kingship and the human condition. Tombs from this period often contained elaborate wooden models, depicting boats, granaries, and daily life, that provide modern historians with a vivid glimpse of ancient Egyptian society. Religious life evolved as well. While the gods of the Old Kingdom retained their power, local deities gained prominence, and the concept of the afterlife became more democratized. No longer was eternal life the sole privilege of pharaohs. Now, common people with proper rituals and texts, like the emerging coffin texts, could aspire to a blessed existence after death. This broader access to the afterlife reflected the Middle Kingdom's ethos of balance and restoration. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also expanded Egypt's influence abroad. Military campaigns extended control into Nubia, where forts and administrative centers asserted Egyptian dominance over trade and gold-rich territories. Diplomacy flourished with Near Eastern states, creating a network of alliances and mutual exchanges. This outward expansion, combined with internal stability, made the Middle Kingdom a period of relative peace and prosperity, one that would later be remembered by Egyptians as a classical age of order and renewal. However, beneath this revival lay seeds of vulnerability. While the pharaohs maintained a firmer grip than their Old Kingdom predecessors, they still relied heavily on provincial officials and mercenaries. Over time, external pressures from nomadic groups and internal weaknesses would test this revived order. Yet, for several centuries, the Middle Kingdom stood as a beacon of restored power, a time when Egypt, reborn on the Nile, reasserted itself as a land of innovation, wealth, and enduring culture. The Middle Kingdom had brought unity, trade, and cultural flourishing to Egypt, but beneath its surface of prosperity lay vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed. After centuries of strong centralized control, the late Middle Kingdom began to show cracks. Successive rulers struggled to maintain authority over Egypt's vast lands. Regional governors, once tightly controlled by the pharaoh, began to regain their influence. The flow of wealth became uneven, and internal rivalries quietly brewed while the Nile continued its eternal flow. It was in this context of weakened unity that a new power emerged in the north, bringing with it unfamiliar customs, foreign gods, and revolutionary tools of war. The Hyksos, a term used by the Egyptians to describe the rulers of foreign lands, were a Semitic-speaking people who likely originated from the regions of Canaan or Syria-Palestine. They did not arrive as an organized army intent on conquest from the very beginning. Instead, they filtered slowly into the fertile delta, settling as traders, artisans, and migrant families. Over time, as Egypt's central power waned, their presence in the delta grew stronger. They intermarried with locals, established trade networks, and eventually began to assert political control. What began as a gradual migration became, by the 17th century BCE, the foundation for a foreign dynasty ruling parts of Egypt. The key to the Hyksos rise was not only Egypt's internal weakness but also their own technological and cultural advantages. They introduced the horse-drawn chariot, a fast and maneuverable weapon of war previously unknown to the Egyptians. Alongside the chariot came new forms of weaponry: the composite bow, capable of shooting arrows farther and with greater force, and improved bronze weapons, sharper and more durable than the tools Egyptian armies were accustomed to. These innovations gave the Hyksos a decisive edge over the traditional infantry-based Egyptian forces, which relied more on archers, spearmen, and slow-moving troops. By around 1650 BCE, the Hyksos had established their capital at Avaris in the eastern Nile delta. From here they ruled over Lower Egypt, controlling key trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and beyond. Their dominance did not extend to all of Egypt, however. In the south, Thebes remained in the hands of native Egyptian rulers, who governed as vassals, paying tribute to their northern overlords. This division created a period of dual rule: the Hyksos in the north and Egyptian princes in the south. Egypt, once unified under mighty pharaohs, was now a land divided. Life under Hyksos influence was not one of constant oppression. They adopted many Egyptian customs, gods, and administrative systems, blending their foreign traditions with the culture of the Nile. Temples continued to function, local agriculture thrived, and trade expanded under their oversight. Yet to the Egyptian elite, the presence of these foreign rulers was a humiliation. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs of the gods, descendants of Horus, chosen to maintain Ma'at, the divine order. To have foreigners rule the sacred land was, in their view, a cosmic imbalance. The Hyksos period also brought new economic opportunities. Trade with the Levant, Nubia, and possibly even distant Mycenaean Greece flourished. Exotic animals, rare woods, and precious metals entered Egypt more frequently than before. Craftsmen learned new techniques, such as improved weaving, pottery, and metalwork. In a paradoxical way, the invaders contributed to Egypt's future military and economic strength by exposing it to new tools and ideas. The southern rulers in Thebes, though subordinate at first, gradually began to assert their independence. They maintained their own army and conducted limited campaigns to secure their borders. The most notable of these rulers were from the 17th dynasty, including Seqenenretau and his sons Kamose and Ahmose. These leaders recognized that the Hyksos presence was both a challenge and an opportunity. If they could drive out the foreigners, they would not only restore Egyptian rule but also claim the mantle of saviors of the two lands. Tensions escalated during the reign of Seqenenretau. Ancient records and later legends describe him as a brave but tragic figure, who took up arms against the Hyksos but suffered a violent death, his skull bearing the marks of brutal blows, possibly from Hyksos axes or maces. His death, however, did not end the struggle. His sons continued the fight, launching raids and fortifying their positions. Kamose, the elder son, waged several campaigns to harass the Hyksos, cutting off their trade routes and attacking their allies. His inscriptions, carved on stelae in Thebes, proclaim his determination to expel the foreign rulers and restore Egypt's honor. The Hyksos, for their part, were not idle. They maintained alliances with Canaanite cities and had access to reinforcements and supplies from the Levant. Their chariot corps remained a formidable force, and their control of the delta gave them a strong economic base. Yet their rule was never fully secure, for they lacked the deep-rooted religious legitimacy that native pharaohs possessed. To the common people they were rulers by power, not by divine right. The turning point came with Ahmose I, the younger brother of Kamose. Taking the throne of Thebes, he reorganized the southern armies, adopted Hyksos military technologies for his own forces, and launched a series of decisive campaigns. His strategy was not only military but also diplomatic. He sought to cut the Hyksos off from their foreign allies, block their sea routes, and slowly squeeze their power base. After years of struggle, the city of Avaris fell. The Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, some fleeing into Canaan, others disappearing into history. The expulsion of the Hyksos marked not only the end of the Second Intermediate Period but also the dawn of a new era. The New Kingdom, a time when Egypt would transform from a land of defense into a land of empire, projecting its power far beyond the Nile. The trauma of foreign occupation left a deep scar on the Egyptian psyche. It taught them that their borders were vulnerable, their armies outdated, and their old ways insufficient. From this bitter lesson arose a new determination. Never again would Egypt allow outsiders to dominate the two lands so easily. Religiously and culturally, the Second Intermediate Period had lasting effects. The Theban god Ammonius rose to prominence during the resistance against the Hyksos, merging with the sun god Ra to become Ammonius Ra, the supreme deity of the New Kingdom. The cult of Ammonius, centered in Thebes, would dominate Egyptian religion and politics for centuries to come. The horse and chariot, once symbols of foreign domination, became emblems of pharaonic might, used in future battles of conquest. For the ordinary people, the period was one of uncertainty but also adaptation. Farmers continued to cultivate the land, craftsmen adapted to new tools, and traders profited from expanded networks. Yet the memory of tribute paid to foreign kings, the sight of foreign troops in Egyptian cities, and the stories of divided rule endured as warnings told to future generations. Thus, the Second Intermediate Period stands as both a time of foreign intrusion and of transformation. It was a period when Egypt, humbled and divided, absorbed new influences that would later fuel its greatest age of power. The Hyksos, though reviled in Egyptian memory as invaders, were also reluctant teachers, forcing Egypt to evolve. Out of their chariots and bows would come the weapons of pharaohs who would later march into Asia and Nubia as conquerors. Out of their rule would come a renewed sense of what it meant to be Egyptian, a people bound not only by the Nile but by a shared determination to reclaim their destiny. The fall of the Hyksos and the reunification of Egypt under strong leadership paved the way for one of the most remarkable periods in ancient Egyptian history, the New Kingdom. Lasting roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE, this era was marked by territorial expansion, flourishing trade, immense wealth and cultural brilliance. It was during this period that Egypt transformed from a regional power into an empire stretching from the Nubian deserts to the Levantine coast. The New Kingdom was not just a political age, it was a renaissance that redefined Egypt's identity on the world stage. The foundations of the New Kingdom were laid by Pharaoh Ahmose I, the leader who expelled the Hyksos and restored native Egyptian rule. He reorganized the state, rebuilt the economy and reasserted control over the Nile Valley. The trauma of foreign rule left its mark on the Egyptian psyche. Never again would they tolerate invasions without response. The strategy shifted from mere defense to active expansion. The Egyptian army adopted the very technologies introduced by their former occupiers, horses, chariots, and advanced weaponry, and used them to project power beyond their traditional borders. This era is often called the Age of Empire because of Egypt's military campaigns and conquests. Under the early rulers of the 18th dynasty, such as Thutmose I and Thutmose III, Egypt extended its influence deep into Nubia in the south and as far north as the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria. Thutmose III, often hailed as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, led numerous campaigns and created an empire of vassal states and tribute-paying territories. This expansion brought immense wealth: gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and exotic goods from across the known world poured into Egyptian temples and palaces. Yet, the New Kingdom was not solely a story of conquest. It was also an age of remarkable rulers whose visions shaped the cultural and spiritual life of Egypt. Among them was Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs who reigned as a king rather than a queen. Her rule was characterized by prosperity, ambitious trade expeditions, including the famous journey to the land of Punt, and monumental building projects such as her stunning mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Despite later attempts to erase her from history, Hatshepsut stands as one of the most capable and forward-thinking rulers of the New Kingdom. Religious transformation also left its mark on this era, particularly during the reign of Akhenaten, who attempted to reshape Egypt's spiritual landscape by promoting the worship of a single god, the Aten, represented by the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, and suppressed the traditional priesthoods of Ammonius and other deities. This experiment in monotheism, known as the Amarna period, was short-lived and deeply controversial. After his death, the old religious order was restored, and Akhenaten's radical legacy was largely dismantled. Following the turbulence of Akhenaten's reign, Egypt saw the brief but famous rule of Tutankhamun. Although his reign was short and relatively insignificant politically, his tomb's discovery in the 20th century made him the most famous of all pharaohs. The treasures found within offered a rare glimpse into the splendor and artistry of the New Kingdom's royal court. Perhaps no ruler symbolizes the power and ambition of the New Kingdom more than Ramses II, often called Ramses the Great. His reign lasted over 6 decades and was marked by monumental construction, including the vast temples of Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum. Ramses II fought major battles, most notably against the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, which ended in one of history's first recorded peace treaties. His reign represented both the height of Egyptian imperial power and the beginning of its gradual decline as the empire overextended and faced mounting challenges. The New Kingdom was also a period of remarkable cultural and artistic flourishing. Temples such as Karnak and Luxor were expanded into vast ceremonial complexes adorned with colossal statues, obelisks and intricately carved reliefs. The Valley of the Kings became the burial ground for pharaohs, hiding their tombs deep in the cliffs to protect them from grave robbers, though many were eventually plundered in antiquity. Literature, art and religious texts flourished, with works such as the Book of the Dead becoming widespread guides to the afterlife. Economically, Egypt thrived during this period thanks to its control of trade routes and the influx of tribute from conquered regions. Luxury goods, exotic animals, and rare resources made their way into the Nile Valley, enriching the elite and funding massive construction projects. The wealth of the temples grew, and the power of the priesthood, especially that of Ammonius at Thebes, became a dominant force in society. This growing influence would later become a source of tension and fragmentation. As the new kingdom progressed, however, cracks began to appear. The cost of maintaining a far-flung empire, coupled with internal corruption and the growing autonomy of regional officials, gradually weakened the central authority. Successive rulers struggled to uphold the legacy of their powerful predecessors. Foreign threats, particularly from the Sea peoples and Libyan tribes, began to encroach upon Egypt's borders. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the empire had lost much of its territory and influence, ushering in a period of division and decline. Despite its eventual weakening, the new kingdom remains one of the most celebrated eras in Egyptian history. It was a time when Egypt stood as a true superpower of the ancient world, when its art, architecture and diplomacy influenced vast regions, and when legendary names like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses II left their enduring marks on history. The new kingdom was the height of Egypt's political and cultural achievements, a testament to the resilience of a civilization that had already endured for millennia. Its monuments still stand as silent witnesses to an age of ambition, faith and empire building, an era when the Nile carried not just water, but the wealth and power of an entire world. By the mid-14th century BCE, Egypt stood as a mighty empire, wealthy from its conquests and trade. The new kingdom had brought prosperity, expansion, and a flourishing of the arts. Yet beneath the surface of Egypt's grandeur, a conflict simmered, one not of swords or armies but of gods and power. This chapter tells the story of Akhenaten, a pharaoh who sought to reshape the spiritual heart of Egypt and in doing so, shook its foundations. Amenhotep IV, the man who would become Akhenaten, came to the throne around 1353 BCE. He was born into a powerful dynasty, the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, and inherited a kingdom at its peak. The temples of Ammonius in Thebes had grown immensely wealthy, their priests nearly as influential as the pharaoh himself. This concentration of religious and economic power in the Ammonius priesthood may have been one of the forces that shaped the young king's radical path. From the start of his reign, Amenhotep IV began favoring a lesser-known solar deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. In the early years, his devotion to Aten was expressed alongside traditional worship. He built new temples for Aten, particularly at Karnak, and promoted this solar god as a source of life and power. The Aten was depicted not as a falcon-headed god or a hidden deity, but as a radiant sun disk with rays ending in hands, touching and blessing the royal family. This image symbolized a direct and personal relationship between the Aten and the pharaoh. Gradually, Amenhotep IV's focus on the Aten became exclusive. By his fifth regnal year he made a dramatic move. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and announced a new vision for Egypt. He founded a new capital city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, on a virgin site in Middle Egypt. Here, far from the influence of Thebes and its powerful clergy, he built temples, palaces and administrative buildings dedicated solely to Aten. The art of the Amarna period reflected this radical shift. Gone were the rigid, idealized forms of traditional Egyptian art. Instead, scenes depicted the royal family in intimate, almost tender moments. Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti cradling their daughters beneath the rays of Aten, their bodies elongated and features exaggerated. Some scholars interpret these changes as a spiritual revolution, others as a political maneuver to curb the might of the Ammonius priesthood. Akhenaten's reforms went further. He ordered the closure of temples to other gods, redirected their wealth to Aten, and suppressed the worship of Ammonius in particular. The names of traditional deities were erased from monuments. Even the plural word gods was sometimes chiseled away. For the first time in Egyptian history, one god was elevated above all others, not quite in the strict sense of monotheism, but as the sole god deserving official worship. Yet this bold experiment met resistance. The people of Egypt, deeply tied to their local gods and ancestral traditions, found the new religion alien and imposed. The Ammonius priesthood, stripped of its wealth and influence, seethed in quiet opposition. Even within the royal court, divisions began to emerge as officials and nobles faced the tension between loyalty to the pharaoh and their own beliefs. For about 17 years, Akhenaten maintained his vision. The capital at Amarna thrived, filled with art, music and the golden light of Aten. But outside its walls Egypt's power faltered. The empire's borders faced growing threats. Hittites in the north, restive vassals in Canaan, and rising instability in Nubia. The focus on religious revolution had drawn attention away from foreign policy and defense. The death of Akhenaten around 1336 BCE marked the beginning of the end for his reforms. His successors, including the mysterious Smenkhare and the young Tutankhaten, later Tutankhamun, were caught in the struggle to restore order. Tutankhamun, likely guided by powerful court officials like Ai and Horemheb, abandoned Amarna, returned the court to Thebes and restored the old gods. The boy king even changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, signaling the return of Ammonius' favor. The Amarna period was officially erased from Egyptian memory. Monuments were dismantled, the city of Akhetaten was abandoned, and Akhenaten was vilified as a heretic. For later generations he became the criminal of Akhetaten, his name struck from king lists. Yet, the artistic and ideological innovations of this period would echo faintly through time, leaving a trace of one of history's earliest experiments with religious centralization. The restoration of the Ammonius cult re-established the traditional pantheon, but the shock of Akhenaten's revolution lingered. It revealed the deep ties between religion and state power, the risks of centralizing worship under one god, and the fragility of even a mighty empire when its spiritual core is shaken. In the centuries that followed, Egypt would continue to honor its many gods, build its temples and worship its pharaohs. But the memory of the sun-worshipping king who turned his back on the old ways remained buried beneath the sands, waiting to be rediscovered in the ruins of Amarna. The new kingdom, with all its glory, had stretched the limits of Egyptian power and wealth. Its pharaohs had built grand monuments, expanded their dominion deep into Nubia and the Levant, and projected an image of invincibility that seemed to echo the glory of the gods themselves. Yet, by the close of the 20th dynasty, the mighty river of Egyptian history had begun to lose its once unyielding current. The seeds of decline had already been sown, economic strain, foreign entanglements and internal corruption, and now the ancient land that had stood united for centuries was poised to fragment once more. The death of Ramesses XI marked the end of the new kingdom and the beginning of an era unlike any that had come before. Power was no longer firmly in the hands of one pharaoh. Rather, it became a contested prize, shared and fought over by competing factions. In the north, the city of Tanis emerged as a royal stronghold under rulers of Libyan descent, while in the south, Thebes became the seat of the high priests of Ammonius, whose religious authority rivaled and often overshadowed that of the pharaoh. This was the dawn of the Third Intermediate Period, a time when Egypt was no longer the conqueror but a land struggling to defend its own borders and maintain its identity amidst waves of foreign influence. The Libyans had been present in Egypt for generations. Originally arriving as mercenaries and settlers during the later New Kingdom, they had slowly integrated into Egyptian society. Over time they gained military and political power, particularly in the Delta region, where their chieftains commanded loyalty from local troops and controlled crucial trade routes. The 21st dynasty, established at Tanis, was the first reflection of this new order. Pharaohs like Smenkhare and Sesenzai ruled from the Delta, far from the traditional capital of Memphis, and even farther from the spiritual heart of Thebes. Their reigns were marked less by grand conquests and more by cautious diplomacy and attempts to maintain balance between the competing centers of power. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the high priests of Ammonius wielded authority that was almost kingly. The immense wealth of the Ammonius temples, built up during the height of the New Kingdom, gave the priesthood both influence and independence. They controlled vast lands, commanded their own armies, and managed trade connections that sustained Upper Egypt even as the central government weakened. Herihor and his successors effectively ruled Thebes as kings in all but name, their titles including grandiose phrases such as Generalissimo of the armies and High Priest of Ammonius. The land of the Nile had become a dual kingdom, not officially divided but fractured in practice. This division created a fertile ground for instability. Without the unifying force of a strong pharaoh, local rulers and military leaders asserted their own power. Provincial cities that had once bowed to the will of the court began to act with greater independence, and foreign trade routes that once enriched Egypt now slipped from its control. The Levantine territories were lost and Nubia, long a source of gold, soldiers and tribute, began to drift out of the Egyptian orbit. The Libyan influence in particular began to shape the culture and politics of the time. Libyan rulers of the 22nd dynasty such as Shoshenq I, managed to reunify much of the country temporarily and even ventured into the Levant to assert Egypt's old claims. Shoshenq I is remembered in the biblical record as Shishak, the pharaoh who raided Jerusalem and plundered the treasures of Solomon's temple. His campaigns briefly revived the notion of Egypt as a regional power, but this revival was fragile and short-lived. Subsequent rulers lacked his strength, and the pattern of fragmentation resumed. As the centuries unfolded, Libyan chiefs intermarried with Egyptian elites, their names appearing in royal lists and temple inscriptions, but their loyalties often lay with their own tribal networks rather than with the Egyptian state. Dynasties rose and fell quickly, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, with each claiming legitimacy, yet none able to truly restore the empire's former might. In some cases, rival dynasties ruled simultaneously in different regions of Egypt, their reigns overlapping in confusing and contested chronologies. This political chaos was accompanied by a gradual erosion of central administration. The intricate bureaucracy that had once collected taxes, managed irrigation and mobilized labor for massive state projects began to break down. Without a steady flow of resources, monumental construction slowed to a trickle. The once mighty temples still stood, but many fell into disrepair, their walls no longer receiving the vibrant reliefs that had once immortalized pharaonic triumphs. Tomb robberies became widespread as impoverished officials and desperate locals plundered the treasures of their ancestors to survive the hard times. Famine and economic hardship further exacerbated the crisis. The Nile, always the lifeline of Egypt, experienced periods of low inundation, reducing agricultural output and creating hunger among the peasantry. Foreign trade, disrupted by instability in the Levant and the rising powers of Assyria and Phoenicia, no longer brought the same wealth of timber, copper, and luxury goods into Egypt. The country, which had once defined the cultural and economic landscape of the eastern Mediterranean, now seemed to watch from the sidelines as new empires rose. Despite this decline, Egyptian culture did not disappear. On the contrary, the Third Intermediate Period saw a fascinating blend of traditions. Libyan and Egyptian customs intermingled, leading to new styles of art, architecture, and burial practices. Pharaohs continued to be buried in grand tombs, though often more modest than those of their predecessors. The temples of Karnak and Luxor remained active, their priests performing rituals that maintained a sense of continuity even in the face of political upheaval. Local elites commissioned statues and stelae that echoed the classical forms of earlier dynasties, a conscious attempt to tie their rule to the golden past. One of the most intriguing features of this period was the role of foreign powers in shaping Egyptian politics. The Libyans were only the first wave. To the south, Nubia grew increasingly powerful, with the kingdom of Kush centered at Napata. The Nubians admired Egyptian culture and in many ways, sought to preserve it even as the Egyptians themselves struggled to do so. To the northeast, the Assyrians loomed as a growing threat, their armies pushing ever closer to the borders of the Nile Valley. Egypt, once the master of foreign lands, was becoming a pawn in the larger game of Near Eastern geopolitics. Religious life during the Third Intermediate Period mirrored the political fragmentation of the time. The cult of Ammonius remained dominant in Thebes, but local deities gained prominence in various regions. Shrines to Batet in Bubastis, to Hathor in Dendera, and to other regional gods flourished as their priesthoods filled the vacuum left by the weakening central authority. This localization of religion strengthened regional identities at the expense of a unified Egyptian identity, further entrenching the divisions that plagued the land. The art of this period, though less grand than that of the New Kingdom, retained a certain refinement. Artists and sculptors often looked back to the great works of the past for inspiration, creating what modern scholars call archaism, a deliberate revival of earlier styles. Statues with the rigid, formal poses of the Old Kingdom reappeared, and inscriptions adopted the careful hieroglyphic forms of the Middle Kingdom. This was both a reflection of nostalgia and a political tool. By invoking the imagery of ancient greatness, rulers of the Third Intermediate Period sought to legitimize their fragile reigns. By the end of the 22nd dynasty, Egypt had become a patchwork of semi-independent states, each governed by local rulers, Libyan chiefs, or powerful priests. In some regions, especially in the Delta, alliances were maintained through intermarriage and diplomacy, while in others, open conflict broke out as ambitious leaders vied for supremacy. The once stable flow of the Nile now ran past a land riddled with uncertainty. The north and south drifted further apart. Tanis and other delta cities maintained their connections with the Mediterranean world, trading with Phoenicia and Greece, while Thebes and Upper Egypt looked increasingly toward Nubia for allies and influence. The two halves of the kingdom still shared a language, a pantheon, and a history, but their political and economic interests had diverged almost beyond repair. This was the reality that defined the first half of the Third Intermediate Period, a land of fated grandeur, of rulers who wore the crowns of their ancestors but commanded only a fraction of their power. Yet even in this time of decline, the story of Egypt was not over. Forces from beyond its borders were watching closely, waiting for their moment to step into the power vacuum. In the next phase of this troubled era, the Nubians would march north, claiming the legacy of the pharaohs for themselves and briefly reviving the dream of a united Nile Valley. The later phases of the Third Intermediate Period marked an era where Egypt's identity and power were increasingly challenged, both from within and by rising powers beyond its borders. While the Libyan and Nubian rulers of earlier decades had left their mark, the continuous fragmentation, shifting alliances, and emergence of new regional elites would take the struggle for Egypt's soul to new heights. In this second half of the period, the country became a land of competing dynasties, intermittent foreign influences, and a struggle between traditional ideals and the demands of survival. By the time the 23rd dynasty took shape in the 8th century BCE, Egypt was no longer a unified realm but rather a patchwork of semi-independent regions. This dynasty, largely based in Upper Egypt, overlapped with the Libyan 22nd dynasty in the north, leading to a situation where two, and at times three, ruling houses claimed legitimacy simultaneously. Some scholars even refer to this as a dynastic web rather than a linear succession, as the lines of power often crossed and intertwined through marriage, military campaigns, and shifting alliances. During this period, Thebes retained its prestige as a religious center, but its political influence fluctuated depending on the ambitions of local rulers and the support of the powerful Ammonius priesthood. The priests of Ammonius, still wielding immense economic and spiritual authority, often acted as kingmakers or mediators, especially when disputes between dynasties threatened to escalate into outright war. Yet, their influence also perpetuated division, as each dynasty sought their blessing to bolster their claim, creating a cycle of dependency and rivalry. The Libyan influence, though initially strong, began to wane as local Egyptian elites reasserted themselves, particularly in the southern regions. In some areas, Libyan rulers became so entrenched that they adopted Egyptian titles, customs, and even participated in temple-building projects, blending their heritage with that of their adopted land. This process of acculturation softened the image of Libyan rulers in the eyes of the populace but did little to resolve the underlying fragmentation. Meanwhile, the Nubians to the south observed Egypt's struggles closely. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Napata, had grown in strength and prosperity, in part due to the decline of Egyptian hegemony over Nubia. As Egypt weakened, Kushite rulers positioned themselves as heirs to the great pharaonic tradition, adopting Egyptian religious practices, royal titulature, and temple architecture. This cultural adoption was not merely symbolic, it set the stage for future political ambitions. Throughout the 8th century BCE, external threats also began to loom larger. The Assyrian Empire, expanding westward and southward from Mesopotamia, cast a long shadow over the Near East. While Egypt remained relatively insulated during the early stages of Assyrian expansion, the destabilization of neighboring regions created a volatile frontier. The Levant, once a sphere of Egyptian influence, increasingly came under Assyrian dominance, cutting Egypt off from trade networks and strategic buffer zones that had long sustained its wealth. Within Egypt, the lack of centralized authority meant that infrastructure, irrigation canals, temple complexes, and trade routes, suffered from neglect or were commandeered by competing factions. Economic strain led to heavier taxation in some regions, further alienating local populations and encouraging resistance. Tomb building and monumental construction, once hallmarks of Egyptian prosperity, became rare and localized, reflecting the diminished resources and priorities of the time. Amid this backdrop of fragmentation, a figure of profound historical significance began to rise. Pi, also known as Pianki, a Kushite king whose reign would eventually mark the transition from the Third Intermediate Period to the 25th dynasty. But before his rise, the conditions that allowed Nubian intervention were laid by decades of Egyptian division and weakened sovereignty. The late stages of the Third Intermediate Period also saw shifting cultural dynamics. While Egyptian traditions persisted in art, language, and religion, foreign influences crept in through trade and diplomacy. Libyan names and styles appeared in official inscriptions, while connections to the Levant and even the Greek world introduced new materials and ideas. These influences were often absorbed into the Egyptian cultural matrix rather than replacing it, but they indicated a society more porous than it had been in its imperial zenith. In the Delta, city-states and local rulers operated with increasing autonomy, forming alliances and rivalries that often ignored the concept of a unified Egyptian state. Cities like Sais began to emerge as influential centers, laying the groundwork for future dynasties that would attempt to restore Egypt's power in the late period. Yet for much of this era, the people of the Delta lived under shifting administrations, each promising stability but often delivering little more than temporary reprieve. Thebes, for its part, oscillated between periods of relative prosperity and decline. Its temples remained active, and its priesthood maintained links to earlier traditions, but the city was no longer the uncontested heart of Egypt. Its rivalries with northern dynasties and occasional alliances with Nubian rulers reflected the pragmatic, often opportunistic politics of the time. By the late 8th century BCE, Egypt was a land poised for change but uncertain of its direction. The overlapping dynasties, 22nd, 23rd, and even the emerging 24th in the western delta, created a climate where no single authority could claim lasting dominance. This era was one of waiting in which various factions maneuvered for advantage while the larger forces of history, Assyrian expansion, Kushite ambition, and internal exhaustion, closed in. One striking feature of this period is the relative paucity of grand monuments compared to earlier ages. While some rulers commissioned temples or additions to existing structures, the scale and ambition of these projects paled in comparison to the pyramids of the Old Kingdom or the colossal temples of the New Kingdom. Instead, inscriptions, modest stelae, and regional administrative records provide much of the evidence for this time. These fragments tell the story of a land rich in history but struggling to project that history into the future. As the Third Intermediate Period neared its end, the political chessboard was set for dramatic upheaval. Tefnakht, a Libyan prince based in Sais, began consolidating power in the western delta, forming what would become the 24th dynasty. His ambitions threatened both the traditional centers of Egyptian power and the rising influence of the Nubians. Pi, seizing the opportunity, launched his famous campaign into Egypt around 727 BCE, presenting himself not as a conqueror but as a restorer of Ma'at, the cosmic order that had long been central to Egyptian kingship. Pi's victory over the northern dynasties and his subsequent coronation in Memphis effectively ended the Third Intermediate Period and inaugurated the Kushite 25th dynasty. Yet, this did not mean the divisions of the previous centuries vanished overnight. Many local rulers retained their positions under Kushite oversight, and the delicate balance between Thebes, Memphis, and Napata required constant negotiation. Looking back, the Third Intermediate Period was not merely an age of decline as it is sometimes portrayed, but a complex era of adaptation, resilience, and regional experimentation. The Egyptian state, though fractured, did not collapse entirely. Its religious traditions endured, its language continued to evolve, and its people adapted to new rulers and circumstances with a pragmatism born of centuries of survival. This era also reshaped the notion of Egyptian identity. No longer tied solely to the idea of a single all-powerful pharaoh, identity became more localized, tied to cities, temples, and regional lords. At the same time, the willingness of foreign dynasties to adopt Egyptian customs suggests that the cultural allure of Egypt remained strong, even when its political influence waned. The legacy of the Third Intermediate Period would ripple into the future. The divisions it entrenched, the alliances it fostered, and the precedents it set for foreign rule all influenced the course of Egyptian history in the late period. It was a time when the shadow of Egypt's past loomed large, but the path forward was being redrawn by a new generation of rulers, some native, some foreign, all navigating the challenges of a fragmented world. In the villages along the Nile, life carried on amid these political shifts. Farmers tended their fields, artisans plied their crafts, and pilgrims visited ancient temples, often oblivious to the grander struggles playing out in distant courts. For them, the river remained the true constant, its annual flood sustaining their lives as it had for millennia. By the time the Third Intermediate Period came to a close, Egypt had been irrevocably changed. It was no longer the imperial power that had once dominated the Near East, but neither was it a land resigned to oblivion. The stage was set for a new chapter, one of Kushite rule, Assyrian invasions, and eventually a brief resurgence of native power before the arrival of the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Thus, the Third Intermediate Period stands as a bridge between two great ages, the imperial glory of the New Kingdom and the tumultuous transformations of the late period. Its story is one of decline, yes, but also of persistence, adaptation, and the enduring magnetism of a civilization that refused to vanish, even in its times of greatest trial. The story of ancient Egypt during the late period is one of resilience under foreign domination, fleeting independence, and continuous struggle to maintain identity amidst powerful external forces. After the turbulence of the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt entered yet another chapter in which its sovereignty would be repeatedly challenged, first by the Assyrians and later by the Persians. This era, spanning from 664 BCE until the arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, represents the twilight of native rule and the complex dance between survival and subjugation. The dawn of the late period began with the rise of the 26th dynasty, known as the Sate dynasty, named after its capital, Sais, located in the western Nile Delta. Psamtik I, Psammetichus I, its founding pharaoh, came to power around 664 BCE with the support of the Assyrian Empire, which at the time was one of the most formidable powers in the Near East. The Assyrians, under Esarhaddon and later Ashurbanipal, had invaded Egypt to expel the Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty, who had ruled from Nubia for nearly a century. The Kushites, though foreign in origin, had embraced Egyptian traditions and presented themselves as restorers of the old ways. Yet, their reign ended violently as the Assyrians swept into Egypt with their iron weaponry, siege engines, and relentless armies. Psamtik I, though installed with Assyrian approval, gradually consolidated his power and maneuvered to reduce Assyrian influence over the Nile Valley. He achieved this through diplomacy, military strength, and clever alliances, including the recruitment of Greek mercenaries, a trend that would become increasingly significant in the coming centuries. Under his rule, Egypt enjoyed a measure of stability and prosperity. He reopened trade routes in the Mediterranean, strengthened Egypt's defenses, and undertook building projects that sought to revive the glory of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. The Sate rulers were keenly aware of their heritage and presented themselves as heirs to a thousand-year-old civilization, even as the geopolitical realities around them shifted. Psamtik I and his successors, including Necho II, Psamtik II, and Apries Wahiber, worked to restore Egypt's influence in the Levant and the eastern Mediterranean. Necho II is particularly remembered for his ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful military campaigns against the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire and his attempts to construct a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a precursor to the modern Suez Canal. His reign also marked increased contact with Greek city-states, especially through the port of Naucratis in the Delta, which became a hub of trade and cultural exchange. Despite these efforts, Egypt remained vulnerable to the great empires of Mesopotamia. The fall of the Assyrian Empire in the late 7th century BCE removed one overlord, only to expose Egypt to the ambitions of the Babylonians. In 605 BCE, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish, effectively ending Egypt's hopes of controlling Syria and Palestine. While Egypt itself avoided direct conquest by Babylon, it was forced to retreat within its borders, and its influence beyond the Nile dwindled. The real shadow over Egypt during the late period came with the rise of the Persian Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BCE. Before their arrival, the Sate dynasty experienced both internal unrest and external pressures, but they maintained a semblance of independence. Psamtik III, the last ruler of the 26th dynasty, faced the full might of Persia under Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great. In 525 BCE, at the Battle of Pelusium, the Persian forces decisively defeated the Egyptians. According to ancient sources, the Persians used a clever psychological tactic by placing animals sacred to the Egyptians, such as cats, in front of their army, knowing the Egyptians would hesitate to harm them. Whether this story is true or not, the result was the same. Egypt was conquered and became a province of the vast Persian Empire. This marked the beginning of the 27th dynasty, often referred to as the First Persian period. Under Persian rule, Egypt was administered as a satrapy or province, governed by a satrap appointed by the Persian king. Cambyses II, despite initial harshness, eventually sought to present himself as a legitimate pharaoh, adopting traditional Egyptian titles and participating in temple rituals. The Persians allowed a degree of autonomy in religious and administrative matters, but heavy taxation and the presence of foreign troops bred resentment among the populace. During this period, the ancient temples of Egypt continued to operate, and many priests were able to maintain their positions. However, there were also acts of desecration recorded by Greek historians, who often portrayed Persian rule as cruel and sacrilegious. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed that Cambyses II insulted Egyptian gods and customs, though modern scholars debate the accuracy of these accounts, suspecting Greek bias against Persia. Resistance against Persian rule was a recurring theme during the late period. Revolts erupted periodically, led by Egyptian nobles or ambitious generals. One of the most notable revolts occurred under the leadership of Amartius in 404 BCE, who successfully expelled the Persians and established the 28th dynasty. This brief moment of independence was followed by two more short-lived dynasties, the 29th and 30th, each struggling to fortify Egypt against the inevitable Persian return. The 30th dynasty, particularly under Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II, represented the last flowering of native Egyptian rule. They invested heavily in temple construction, reinforcing the cultural and religious identity of the land, and sought alliances with Greek city-states to counter Persian power. However, internal divisions and the overwhelming might of the Achaemenid Empire eventually doomed their efforts. In 343 BCE, Artaxerxes III reconquered Egypt, ushering in the Second Persian period, 31st dynasty. This time, Persian rule was harsher and more exploitative, as the empire faced growing instability from external threats and internal rebellions elsewhere. Egypt, once the beacon of ancient civilization, had become a pawn in the power struggles of greater empires. Yet, throughout these centuries of foreign rule, Egyptian culture, religion, and traditions endured. The temples of the gods still stood, the hieroglyphic script continued to be carved, and the memory of the pharaohs lingered in the hearts of the people. By the end of the 4th century BCE, a new power emerged in the Mediterranean world: Macedon, under the leadership of Alexander the Great. The Persians, weakened by internal strife and external wars, were ill-prepared to defend their Egyptian satrapy. In 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt with little resistance, welcomed as a liberator rather than a conqueror. His arrival would mark the end of the late period and the beginning of a new chapter in Egyptian history, the Hellenistic age under the Ptolemaic dynasty. The late period, then, was not a time of great monuments or sweeping triumphs but of resilience in the face of decline. It was an age where Egypt, though often subdued by stronger empires, continued to assert its identity, revive its traditions, and wait for moments to reclaim its independence, however fleeting they might have been. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE brought the Nile under the control of the largest empire the world had yet seen, the Achaemenid Empire. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, led the campaign that subdued the divided Egyptian factions. The Persians capitalized on the weakened Sate dynasty's internal rivalries and the lingering discontent among local nobles. After the decisive Battle of Pelusium, where, according to Greek sources, Cambyses used psychological tactics such as sacred animals to demoralize Egyptian defenders, Memphis fell swiftly. The 26th dynasty was overthrown, and the Sate line came to an end with the capture of Pharaoh Psamtik III. Egypt was reorganized as a satrapy of the Persian Empire. Persian rulers presented themselves as pharaohs in traditional regalia and participated in key religious rituals to gain legitimacy. Darius I, for example, undertook construction works, restored temples, and even codified laws. He ordered the restoration of canals and promoted agriculture to stabilize the province's economy. However, Persian rule was often seen as foreign domination rather than an organic continuation of the pharaonic tradition. The heavy taxation, the recruitment of Egyptians for imperial campaigns, and occasional desecration of sacred practices fueled resentment. Over the next century, Egypt oscillated between submission and revolt. Native dynasties would occasionally reassert brief independence, only to be crushed by returning Persian armies. In 404 BCE, following the death of Darius II, Egypt succeeded in expelling the Persians for a short period under the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties. These dynasties, though short-lived, are notable for their persistent resistance. Amartius of Sais, the sole ruler of the 28th dynasty, leveraged Persian instability to establish his authority. The subsequent rulers, such as Nectanebo I of the 30th dynasty, undertook ambitious building projects and attempted to revive Egypt's waning prestige by restoring temples and fortifying the delta. However, Egypt's resurgence was fragile. The shifting alliances of Greek city-states, the rise of Sparta and Athens, and the growing influence of mercenary forces in Egyptian armies all made the land of the Nile a geopolitical chessboard. Greek mercenaries became a crucial element of Egyptian defense, a sign that the once self-sufficient warrior state was now dependent on external powers for survival. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh of Egypt, relied heavily on Greek allies to repel Persian advances, but his reign was plagued by internal rivalries and the overwhelming might of the Persian war machine. In 343 BCE, Artaxerxes III reconquered Egypt, marking the Second Persian period. The Persian administration during this phase was harsher, seeking to firmly integrate Egypt into the empire and prevent further rebellions. Temples were looted, rebellious cities were punished severely, and Egyptian nobles were closely monitored or replaced with loyal officials from other satrapies. The cultural tension between the native traditions of the Nile and the imperial order of Persia deepened. Priests of Ammonius and other key religious centers often became focal points of resistance, though their influence was increasingly curtailed. Amid this turbulence, Egyptian society adapted. While political independence was lost, the ancient traditions of religion, art, and literature persisted. Temples remained centers of learning and administration, scribes continued to record in hieroglyphs and demotic script, and local festivals celebrated the cycles of the Nile. Yet the grandeur of earlier eras was absent. The monumental architecture of the Old and New Kingdoms gave way to more modest construction, often overseen or funded by foreign rulers seeking to placate the gods of Egypt. The arrival of the Persians also accelerated the integration of Egypt into a broader Near Eastern world. Trade routes flourished, connecting the Nile to Mesopotamia, Persia, and even India through Persian-controlled territories. Goods such as timber, spices, and metals moved more freely, but this integration also meant that Egypt was no longer an isolated powerhouse. It was a province in a vast imperial network. The late period was also marked by the increasing presence of Greek influence. Even under Persian domination, Greek traders, soldiers, and adventurers frequented Egyptian ports. Naucratis, a Greek trading colony in the Nile Delta established during the Sate period, grew in prominence as a hub of cross-cultural exchange. Greek language, art, and ideas began to seep into Egyptian cities, foreshadowing the seismic changes that would come with Alexander the Great. By the mid-4th century BCE, the Persian Empire itself was showing signs of overextension. Internal revolts, court intrigues, and the growing threat of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander created openings for ambitious leaders. Nectanebo II, despite his eventual defeat, represented the last flicker of native resistance against this tide. When Artaxerxes III reasserted control, he attempted to reorganize Egypt as a loyal satrapy, but resentment simmered beneath the surface. In 332 BCE, the course of Egyptian history changed forever with the arrival of Alexander the Great. Marching swiftly through Persian territories, he was welcomed by many Egyptians as a liberator rather than a conqueror. To the weary people of the Nile, the Macedonian king represented the end of Persian oppression and the promise of restoration. At Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh according to ancient rites, and he made offerings to the gods of Egypt, particularly Ammonius at the Siwa oasis, where he was declared the son of Zeus Ammon. This transition marked the end of the late period and the dawn of the Hellenistic era. The ancient traditions of Egypt would now blend with Greek culture, birthing the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Persians had been the last great Eastern power to dominate the Nile before the westward tide of Hellenism reshaped the region. Looking back, the late period stands as a time of resilience and transition. Though often remembered for foreign domination, it was also an era in which Egyptian identity persisted against overwhelming odds. Temples continued to honor the gods, scribes preserved the stories of the past, and the land itself, fed by the eternal Nile, remained the lifeblood of its people. The pharaohs may have changed and foreign banners may have flown over Memphis and Thebes, but the spirit of Egypt endured, waiting for the next chapter in its long and storied history. When the Macedonian army, led by Alexander the Great, crossed into Egypt in 332 BCE, the ancient land along the Nile had already witnessed 3 millennia of triumphs, upheavals, and foreign dominations. It had endured the rise and fall of its own dynasties, invasions by Libyans and Nubians, and the iron grip of the Persians. Yet, the arrival of Alexander was different. Less an invasion, more a dramatic reorientation of the Nile's fate toward a new world order that would bind Egypt to the Greek-speaking Mediterranean for centuries. The Persians had ruled Egypt as one of their satrapies, enforcing tribute and occasionally desecrating temples that defied their control. Their reign had been resented, but the Nile's people were weary of resistance after so many centuries of instability. So when the young Macedonian king, fresh from victories at Issus and Tyre, marched into their land, he was not met with a united army but with cautious curiosity. The Persian satrap Mazax surrendered Memphis without resistance, sparing the region from destruction. For the Egyptians, Alexander was not only a liberator from Persian rule but also a figure whose presence seemed to echo their own myths. A foreigner, yes, but one chosen by the gods to restore balance. Alexander played this perception to perfection. He visited the sacred temple of Ptah at Memphis, made sacrifices according to Egyptian custom, and ordered his name to be inscribed in hieroglyphs as Son of Ra. Most importantly, he undertook a journey to the Siwa oasis in the western desert, where the oracle of Ammonius, the same god who had once legitimized the rule of great pharaohs, proclaimed him a divine son. From that moment, Alexander was not merely a conqueror. He was a pharaoh, a god-king whose rule carried the blessing of Egypt's ancient deities. In his brief stay, Alexander founded a city that would shape the destiny of the entire region, Alexandria. Situated on the Mediterranean coast, west of the Nile Delta, it was designed to be a bridge between Greek culture and Egyptian tradition. Its layout followed the classical grid of Hellenistic cities, yet its harbor opened Egypt to the wider Mediterranean in a way no other settlement had before. Alexander never lived to see its rise. He left soon after, continuing his conquest toward Persia and India, but the seeds were planted for a new era. After his death in 323 BCE in Babylon, his vast empire fractured among his generals, the Diadochi. In Egypt, the satrap Ptolemy, one of Alexander's trusted companions, took control. He carried Alexander's body to Memphis and later to Alexandria, enshrining it in a magnificent tomb that became a pilgrimage site for centuries. By claiming guardianship of the conqueror's remains, Ptolemy secured a symbolic and political link to Alexander's divine legacy. The Ptolemaic dynasty officially began in 305 BCE, when Ptolemy declared himself king and pharaoh of Egypt. Unlike previous foreign rulers, the Ptolemies embraced many aspects of Egyptian tradition while overlaying them with Greek governance and culture. The court spoke Greek, the administration followed Hellenistic models, and new cities were founded in the Greek style. Yet the temples of old gods were rebuilt, priesthoods restored, and pharaonic rituals continued. In their portraits, the Ptolemies appeared both as Greek monarchs and Egyptian pharaohs, a dual identity that allowed them to rule for nearly 3 centuries. This blending of cultures, what historians call Hellenistic Egypt, was not immediate nor always harmonious. The Greeks formed an elite ruling class, concentrated in cities like Alexandria, Naucratis, and Ptolemy, while the native Egyptians largely remained in rural areas, bound to the Nile's agricultural cycles. Tensions often flared, especially when heavy taxation or foreign wars drained the kingdom's wealth. Yet this period also witnessed unprecedented intellectual, artistic, and scientific flourishing. Alexandria became the crown jewel of the Ptolemaic realm. It was not only a port city but a center of learning, commerce, and culture that rivaled Athens and surpassed it in cosmopolitan grandeur. The famed Library of Alexandria, though its exact size and fate remain debated, symbolized the dynasty's ambition to collect, translate, and preserve all the world's knowledge. Scholars in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature flocked to the city. Euclid laid the foundations of geometry, Herophilus dissected the human body, and Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. The city's lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria, stood as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Rising over 100 meters, its beacon guided ships across the Mediterranean and proclaimed Egypt's renewed position as a nexus of trade and power. Religion, too, evolved in this era of cultural blending. The Ptolemies promoted the worship of Serapis, a syncretic deity combining aspects of Osiris, Apis, and Hellenistic gods like Zeus. Serapis was meant to unify the religious sensibilities of Greeks and Egyptians, and his cult spread widely across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, traditional temples from Karnak to Philae continued to function, often receiving royal patronage as the Ptolemies sought legitimacy among their Egyptian subjects. Yet beneath the splendor, cracks remained. The countryside often bore the brunt of the dynasty's military and economic ambitions. Rebellions flared periodically in Upper Egypt, and resentment toward the Greek elite never fully disappeared. The Ptolemies, while patrons of learning and art, were also embroiled in endless dynastic struggles, court intrigues, and costly wars with rivals like the Seleucids. Their empire stretched into Cyrene and parts of the Levant, but these possessions were often contested. By the 2nd century BCE, the strength of the Ptolemaic state began to wane. Corruption, civil war, and increasing Roman interference set the stage for a slow decline. But the Hellenistic age in Egypt had already transformed the land profoundly. It was no longer a secluded kingdom defined solely by the Nile and its ancient gods. It was now a crossroads of Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern worlds. This was the age when hieroglyphs began to coexist with Greek scripts, when statues of pharaohs bore both Greek and Egyptian features, and when the Nile became not just the heart of an ancient civilization, but a vital artery in a global Mediterranean network. The story of Alexander and the rise of the Ptolemies was thus both a continuation and a reimagining of Egypt's history. It connected the wisdom of the Old Kingdom with the ambitions of a new world, one that would eventually fall under the shadow of Rome but leave an enduring legacy in art, science, and culture. The Ptolemaic period was a time of contrasts, of dazzling cosmopolitanism in Alexandria and simmering unrest in the Nile Valley. As the dynasty matured, it learned to manipulate both its Greek and Egyptian heritage to maintain control, but it could never fully merge the two into a seamless whole. Ptolemy I Soter, the founder, ruled with pragmatism. His successors, particularly Ptolemy II Philadelphus, r. 283 to 246 BCE, expanded the kingdom's wealth and influence. Ptolemy II continued the construction of Alexandria, sponsored monumental works, and strengthened the library and museum, Mauson, which attracted intellectuals from across the Hellenistic world. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, was commissioned under his reign, a testament to the city's diverse and interconnected culture. Trade thrived during this era. The Nile provided a backbone for agriculture, while the ports linked Egypt to the Aegean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean. Grain, papyrus, glass, and luxury goods flowed outward, while spices, incense, and exotic animals arrived from distant lands. The Ptolemies maintained a fleet to protect these routes, and their navy was among the most formidable in the Mediterranean. Despite these achievements, the dynasty was plagued by internal rivalries. Brother married sister in the style of old pharaohs to consolidate power, but such incestuous unions often fueled conspiracies and assassinations. Ptolemy VIII, known for his cruelty, left a legacy of civil strife, while rival claimants and co-regents frequently plunged the kingdom into chaos. For the Egyptian population, daily life changed less dramatically than one might expect. The temples remained centers of religious and economic activity. Priests held land, collected taxes, and mediated between people and state. However, the Greek administration often favored Greek settlers with privileges and reduced burdens, deepening the social divide. Inscriptions and papyri from the period reveal both cooperation and tension between the two communities. Religion continued to adapt. The worship of Isis, long a Central Egyptian cult, began spreading across the Mediterranean, evolving in form but retaining its emotional appeal as a goddess of magic, motherhood, and the sea. The blending of Greek and Egyptian traditions gave birth to a multicultural spiritual landscape that would outlast the Ptolemies themselves. By the 1st century BCE, the dynasty's decline became evident. External threats loomed. Rome, having subdued the Seleucid Empire and Carthage, now turned its attention to Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Internally, rival factions vied for influence, often appealing to Roman intervention to secure their claims. The most famous of these late Ptolemaic rulers would be Cleopatra VII, but her story belongs to the final chapter of Egypt's pharaonic history. For now, in this 11th chapter, what stands out is the transformation set in motion by Alexander's conquest. A shift from a world of isolated river valleys to one of global connections, from hieroglyphic stelae to scrolls housed in the greatest library of the ancient world, from pharaohs born of the Nile to rulers who traced their lineage to Macedonia yet wore the double crown. The Ptolemaic era left behind monumental legacies. Temples like those at Edfu and Dendera, though built under Greek rule, preserved and even revived ancient architectural forms. Statues of the kings often depicted them in the traditional pose, striding forward with the crook and flail, yet their inscriptions bore Greek titles. Coins carried their portraits in the Hellenistic style, ensuring their image circulated far beyond the Nile. Economically, the kingdom was both a marvel and a cautionary tale. Its granaries fed the Mediterranean, but oppressive taxation and monopolies often impoverished the peasantry. Rebellions in Upper Egypt, particularly in Thebes, flared repeatedly, forcing the Ptolemies to divert resources to suppress them. Culturally, however, this period bridged worlds. Greek became the language of administration, but Demotic Egyptian survived in contracts, letters, and daily life. Artists fused styles. Statues might show a Greek physique with an Egyptian kilt, or a sphinx might bear the features of a Macedonian king. This was also a time of increasing contact with Rome. Roman merchants frequented Alexandria, and Roman politicians sought alliances and influence in Egyptian affairs. By the late 2nd century BCE, Egypt was as much a client state of Rome as it was an independent power. Thus, the conquest of Alexander and the rule of the Ptolemies marked the penultimate act of ancient Egypt's grand story. It was an age of innovation and tension, of glory and exploitation, of bridges built between civilizations that had once seemed worlds apart. The Nile still flooded, the temples still echoed with prayers, but the world around them had changed forever. The final chapter would not be written by a Greek nor an Egyptian pharaoh, but by the shadow of Rome and the ambitions of a queen who sought to hold both worlds in her hands. The story of ancient Egypt was now approaching its dramatic and fateful conclusion. For over 3,000 years, the Nile had nourished a civilization unlike any other. It had seen mighty pharaohs, colossal monuments, invasions, renaissances, and decline. But by the 1st century BCE, Egypt was no longer the unchallenged power it had once been. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, ruled the land not as native sons of the Nile but as foreign monarchs with Greek heritage. Their rule was a mixture of Hellenistic splendor and ancient Egyptian tradition, a hybrid court where Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian gods, and where power was maintained through intrigue, manipulation, and the ever-present influence of the Roman Republic, the rising superpower of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra VII Philopator, born in 69 BCE, entered this world of fading grandeur and growing foreign dominance. She was a descendant of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, who, after the conqueror's death in 323 BCE, had claimed Egypt as his share of the divided empire. Over nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic rulers had maintained their grip, not through invincible armies, but through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the immense wealth generated by the fertile Nile. Yet, by the time Cleopatra came of age, the dynasty had rotted from within. Family members betrayed each other, siblings fought over the throne, and the great library of Alexandria, symbol of their intellectual power, presided over a kingdom that was now dependent on the goodwill of Rome. Cleopatra was not the only heir. Like her predecessors, she grew up in a court where marriages between brothers and sisters were common, and where alliances shifted with the winds of power. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was a weak ruler, often mocked by his own people for his dependence on Rome and his inability to control Egypt's finances. When he died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra, only 18, was made co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Their co-regency, however, was doomed from the start. The court quickly split into factions, some favoring Cleopatra, others backing her brother. What began as a shared rule turned into open conflict. Cleopatra, unlike many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, possessed both intellect and ambition in abundance. She was not only highly educated, speaking several languages including Egyptian, which many earlier Ptolemies had neglected to learn, but also politically astute and unafraid of bold decisions. Her aim was not merely to hold the throne, but to restore Egypt's fading power and assert its independence from Rome's suffocating grip. But fate had already placed Egypt firmly within Rome's sphere of influence, and the Republic was in the midst of its own upheavals. The rivalry between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had escalated into a full-scale civil war, and this Roman conflict would soon become entwined with Egypt's own royal struggles. In 48 BCE, Pompey, fleeing Caesar's advance after his defeat at Pharsalus, sought refuge in Egypt. The young Ptolemy XIII, influenced by his advisors, saw an opportunity to curry favor with Caesar by eliminating Pompey. In a move that shocked even the ruthless Romans, Pompey was assassinated upon landing in Egypt, his severed head presented to Caesar as a gift when he arrived in Alexandria shortly after. Cleopatra, who had been forced into exile during the internal power struggle, recognized her moment. She secretly re-entered Alexandria and, according to legend, famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled in a carpet or sack. This daring act won her an audience with the Roman general, and from that moment, their fates intertwined. Caesar, though initially in Egypt only to pursue Pompey, found himself drawn into the Ptolemaic civil war. Supporting Cleopatra's claim over that of her brother, he fought a brief but intense campaign in Alexandria, known as the Alexandrian War. Ptolemy XIII eventually perished, drowning in the Nile during the fighting, and Cleopatra was restored to the throne, now co-ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as per custom. However, she was now firmly aligned with Rome, through Caesar. Their political alliance soon became a personal one as well. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, commonly known as Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. This child became a symbol of her hopes, a link between Egypt and Rome, and perhaps a bridge to restore her kingdom's strength. Cleopatra traveled to Rome and stayed there for a time, sparking scandal and fascination alike in the Roman capital. But her fortunes shifted dramatically in 44 BCE, when Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March. Her protector was gone and Rome plunged once more into civil war. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, now determined to protect her son's future and her throne amidst the chaos. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart between the forces of the assassins Brutus and Cassius on one side and the second triumvirate, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, on the other. It was in this tumultuous arena that the next chapter of her life unfolded, one that would seal both her legend and Egypt's fate. By 41 BCE, Mark Antony, one of the triumvirs and a brilliant general known for his charisma and excesses, summoned Cleopatra to answer accusations that she had supported his enemies during the Roman Civil War. Their meeting in Tarsus on the Cydnus River would become one of the most famous encounters in ancient history. Cleopatra, aware that survival now hinged on winning Antony's favor, staged her arrival as a spectacle of divine grandeur. She sailed upriver in a magnificent barge with purple sails, reclining dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants fanning her with peacock feathers. Antony, already notorious for his love of luxury, was captivated. What began as a political negotiation evolved into one of history's most legendary romances. Antony followed Cleopatra back to Egypt, where the two became inseparable. For Antony she offered wealth, resources, and the promise of an Eastern empire. For Cleopatra he was the means to maintain Egypt's independence in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Together they embarked on a program of lavish spending, military planning, and symbolic gestures meant to unite the Eastern Mediterranean under their joint rule. Cleopatra bore him 3 children, and for a time, it seemed the dream of reviving Egypt's former glory might be within reach. However, in Rome, Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, was consolidating his own power. He viewed Antony's alliance with Cleopatra not only as a political threat but as an affront to Roman values. Propaganda flowed from Rome, portraying Cleopatra as a foreign seductress who had bewitched Antony and sought to corrupt the Roman world. Their union was framed as a betrayal of Rome, and by 32 BCE, war between Octavian and Antony was inevitable. The decisive moment came in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, fought off the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet faced Octavian's forces, commanded by the skilled Admiral Agrippa. The battle turned disastrous for the lovers. Cleopatra, fearing entrapment, retreated with her ships, and Antony, abandoning the fight, followed her. This flight doomed their cause. Octavian pursued them into Egypt, and in 30 BCE, his forces entered Alexandria. The final act of the ancient Egyptian monarchy played out in these tense weeks. Antony, faced with betrayal and defeat, fell upon his sword. Cleopatra, realizing that she would be paraded as a captive in Octavian's triumph, chose to end her life as well. Ancient sources differ on the method. Some claim she used a poisonous asp hidden in a basket of figs. Others suggest a fast-acting poison applied to a hairpin. Whatever the truth, her death at the age of 39 marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and with it the era of the Pharaohs. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was captured and killed on Octavian's orders. "Too many Caesars is not good," he reportedly said. Her other children by Antony were spared but taken to Rome, where they vanished from the political stage. Egypt was formally annexed as a Roman province, governed by a prefect answerable directly to the emperor. Octavian returned to Rome triumphant, soon to be known as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The fall of Cleopatra was more than the end of a dynasty. It was the conclusion of over 3 millennia of independent Egyptian rule. The temples of the old gods still stood, the Nile still flowed, but the political heart of the land had shifted permanently. Rome would exploit Egypt as its breadbasket, its grain feeding the teeming capital across the Mediterranean. The pyramids became curiosities for tourists, and the great monuments of Thebes, Memphis, and Giza slowly crumbled under the passage of time. Yet Cleopatra herself would not be forgotten. Roman poets and historians painted her alternately as a scheming temptress and a tragic queen. In later centuries she became a figure of fascination, a symbol of beauty, intelligence, and doomed ambition. From Plutarch's biographies to Shakespeare's plays, her legend endured far longer than her reign. With her death, the line of pharaohs that had begun in the mists of prehistory, with Narmer uniting the two lands, was finally extinguished. Egypt became a jewel in the crown of the Roman Empire, its ancient culture gradually blending with Greco-Roman traditions, its language shifting, its religion evolving, until only ruins and memories remained of the once great kingdom of the Nile. The story of Cleopatra and the fall of the pharaohs is thus a story of both an ending and a beginning, the end of ancient Egypt as an independent civilization, and the beginning of its transformation into one of the most storied provinces of the Roman world. Through her cunning, charm, and tragic fate, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt's final chapter would be written not in silence, but in a blaze of drama that the world would never forget.